In 1959, Marty Robbins released a song about a Mexican cantina that would change country music forever. But the real story behind his border ballads was hiding in plain sight. While other Nashville stars were singing about honky-tonks and broken hearts, Robbins was telling tales of Mexican gunfighters and forbidden love. Growing up in the Arizona desert, young Martin Robinson was surrounded by Mexican culture, but his connection went deeper than anyone realized. After months of research and uncovering rare interviews, I've pieced together how these songs weren't just stories he made up. They were based on real places, real people, and real events that shaped not just his music, but the entire landscape of country music. Born Martin David Robinson on September 26, 1925, in Glendale, Arizona, Marty's early life was far from the Nashville spotlight he would later command. The desert town sat just 180 miles from the Mexican border, where the sounds of mariachi music and Spanish guitars drifted through the streets. His father's job as a handyman often took young Martin to Mexican neighborhoods, where he absorbed the culture, music, and stories that would later influence his legendary border ballads. But life wasn't easy for the Robinson family. During the Great Depression, they moved frequently between Phoenix and Glendale, searching for work. Marty found solace in the radio, particularly in the border radio stations broadcasting from Mexico. These powerful stations, known as border blasters, played a mix of country music and Mexican rancheras that would later shape his unique sound. At age 12, Marty received his first guitar from a neighbor. He learned to play by mimicking both the country songs of Gene Autry and the Mexican folk songs he heard in his neighborhood. His sister Mamie later recalled how young Martin would spend hours practicing Spanish guitar techniques he learned from local Mexican musicians. The poverty of his childhood actually pushed him closer to the Mexican community. While other kids his age were in school, Marty often worked alongside Mexican laborers in the cotton fields and citrus groves around Phoenix. Here, during lunch breaks and after work, he learned traditional Mexican ballads and the art of storytelling through song, a skill that would become his trademark. The turning point came when Marty joined the Navy in 1943. Stationed in the Pacific during World War II, he entertained fellow sailors with songs that blended country music with the Mexican styles he grew up with. It was here that he began crafting his signature storytelling style, weaving tales of love, betrayal, and redemption against the backdrop of the American Southwest. His fellow sailors were particularly drawn to his border ballads, proving that these stories had universal appeal far beyond the Southwest. But it wasn't until he returned from the war that Marty would discover the true power of these border town stories. In fact, the creation of his masterpiece, El Paso, came from a chance encounter that would change the course of country music history. The real story behind this legendary song begins with a late-night drive along the Texas-Mexico border and a mysterious cantina that would inspire one of country music's greatest tales. That late-night drive happened in 1956 when Marty was touring through Texas. While most country stars stuck to the main highways, Robbins had a habit of taking the back roads, especially near the border. He claimed these drives helped him think, but the truth was he was searching for something, inspiration from the same border culture that shaped his childhood. On this particular night, Robbins found himself on the outskirts of El Paso. The neon lights of the border town flickered in the distance when he spotted it. Rosa's Cantina. The small adobe building sat quietly in the desert, but inside the sounds of Spanish guitars and laughter spilled into the night. This wasn't just any bar, it was a piece of the authentic border culture Marty had grown up with. What happened inside Rosa's that night remains a mystery. Robbins never fully revealed the details, but we do know he spent several hours there, watching the dancers, listening to the music, and talking with the locals. When he emerged, the basic structure of El Paso was already forming in his mind. But writing the song wasn't simple. Robbins spent nearly 3 years perfecting the story, drawing from his deep understanding of Mexican culture to create something authentic. He insisted on using Spanish guitars instead of the typical Nashville sound, a decision that initially met resistance from his record label. The song's length, 4 minutes and 38 seconds, was practically unheard of in an era when most country songs barely reached 3 minutes. Even more revolutionary was his use of Spanish words and phrases. While other country artists might have thrown in an occasional amigo for effect, Robbins incorporated authentic Spanish terminology throughout the song. The character of Felina, spelled this way intentionally to help with pronunciation, was crafted to embody the Mexican feminine mystique he'd grown up admiring. The song's structure was equally groundbreaking. Instead of following the standard verse-chorus format, Robbins created a complete narrative arc, more like a Mexican corrido than a typical country song. He later admitted that he learned this storytelling style from the Mexican balladeers of his youth. The recording process itself was just as unconventional. Robbins insisted on using authentic Mexican guitar techniques, bringing in Grady Martin to play the distinctive Spanish guitar riffs. He also fought to include the dramatic backing vocals that echo the main narrative, a technique common in Mexican folk songs but rarely heard in country music. Even the tempo changes throughout the song, another departure from country music norms, were inspired by the dramatic pacing of Mexican corridos. When Robbins finally recorded El Paso in 1959, nobody, not his label, not radio stations, and certainly not the country music establishment, was prepared for what would happen next. The song's release would trigger a cultural phenomenon that would not only change Robbins' career forever, but would open the door for a whole new kind of country music. And the story behind its meteoric rise to success is even more fascinating than the song itself. When El Paso hit the airwaves in late 1959, it faced an uphill battle. Radio stations were hesitant to play a country song that long, and many questioned whether mainstream audiences would accept its Mexican influences. But Robbins had tapped into something powerful, a cultural crossroads that would prove irresistible to listeners. The song didn't just climb the country charts, it exploded across genres. By January 1960, El Paso had accomplished something unprecedented. It topped both the country and pop charts simultaneously. This wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural phenomenon. The song spent 7 weeks at #1 on the country charts and 2 weeks atop the Billboard Hot 100, making Robbins the first country artist to cross over with a story song of this complexity. The Grammy Awards took notice too. In 1961, at the 3rd Annual Grammy Awards, El Paso won the award for Best Country and Western Recording. This victory was particularly significant because it legitimized the fusion of country music with Mexican influences. The recording industry had officially acknowledged that country music could embrace other cultural elements while maintaining its authenticity. But the song's impact went far beyond awards and chart positions. El Paso created a new template for country music storytelling. Its success proved that audiences would not only accept, but embrace longer, more complex narratives. The song's cinematic quality, with its vivid descriptions and dramatic plot, essentially created a new subgenre, the country music movie and song. Radio stations that had initially balked at the song's length were forced to revise their policies. If El Paso could keep listeners engaged for nearly 5 minutes, maybe the 3-minute rule wasn't as crucial as they thought. This opened the door for other artists to experiment with longer, more elaborate compositions. The song's success also challenged Nashville's rigid musical boundaries. The Spanish guitar riffs and Mexican-influenced melody proved that country music could incorporate diverse musical elements without losing its essential character. Soon other artists began experimenting with similar cross-cultural influences, enriching the country music landscape. The impact on Robbins' career was equally dramatic. He went from being a successful country singer to a genuine crossover star. His concerts began attracting a more diverse audience, including many Mexican-American fans who appreciated his authentic approach to their cultural elements. Music critics, who had previously dismissed country music as simplistic, now wrote serious analyses of his storytelling techniques and cultural fusion. But El Paso was just the beginning. Robbins had unleashed something powerful, and he knew it. With the massive success of his Mexican-influenced masterpiece, he was ready to dive deeper into this unique fusion of cultures. His next series of border ballads would prove that El Paso wasn't just a lucky break. It was the start of a musical revolution that would produce some of country music's most enduring classics. Following the success of El Paso, Robbins knew he had struck storytelling gold in the border territory. But rather than simply trying to recreate his hit, he began exploring different aspects of border culture, each new song revealing another piece of his deep connection to Mexican traditions. Big Iron, released in 1959, took a different approach to the border narrative. Instead of a love story, this tale focused on an Arizona Rangers showdown with a deadly outlaw named Texas Red. The song's structure borrowed heavily from the Mexican corrido tradition of celebrating gunfighters, both heroes and villains. What many listeners didn't realize was that Robbins had grown up hearing similar tales from Mexican ranch hands who worked alongside him in the cotton fields. The song's authenticity came from Robbins' intimate knowledge of both cultures. The Big Iron on his hip referenced the Colt single-action army revolver, popular with both American lawmen and Mexican rurales. The setting in the town of Agua Fria, meaning cold water in Spanish, was typical of the bilingual nature of the border region Robbins knew so well. Tonight, Carmen delved even deeper into Mexican culture. Released in 1960, this passionate tale of forbidden love showcased Robbins' understanding of Mexican romantic traditions. The song's protagonist wasn't just visiting Mexico. He was fully immersed in its culture, speaking Spanish and understanding the delicate social customs surrounding courtship. Robbins drew from his childhood memories of watching Mexican couples dancing in Phoenix's barrios, where romance followed strict cultural protocols. "They're Hanging Me Tonight," while not explicitly set in Mexico, used the dramatic storytelling style of Mexican folk ballads to tell its tale of love and murder. The song's mournful Spanish guitar and its theme of tragic consequences for crimes of passion echoed the corridos Robbins had heard on those powerful border radio stations as a youth. But perhaps his most ambitious follow-up was El Paso City, released in 1976. This meta-narrative, told from the perspective of a modern traveler flying over El Paso, reflected on the original story while adding new layers of meaning. Robbins claimed the idea came to him exactly as described in the song, while flying over El Paso in his private plane. The song proved that even 17 years after the original, the border territory still had stories to tell. Each of these songs built upon Robbins' reputation as country music's premier storyteller, but they also served a deeper purpose. Through these ballads, he was preserving the oral traditions of both cultures, the American West and Mexico, that had shaped his childhood. The songs weren't just entertainment, they were historical documents of a unique time and place where two cultures merged along the border. These border ballads weren't just songs, they were cultural bridges built from authentic musical elements that Robbins had absorbed throughout his life. But to truly understand their impact, we need to examine the specific Mexican musical influences that made these songs so unique. The story behind these distinctive guitar sounds and storytelling techniques reveals just how deep Robbins' connection to Mexican culture really went. The distinctive sound of Marty Robbins' border ballads didn't happen by accident. Every guitar riff, vocal technique, and musical arrangement was carefully chosen to authentically represent the Mexican musical traditions he'd grown up with. But bringing these elements into country music required both courage and careful execution. At the heart of Robbins' border sound was the Spanish guitar work, played brilliantly by session guitarist Grady Martin. But it was Robbins who insisted on the specific techniques, the fast runs, the dramatic flourishes, and the distinctive finger-picking patterns that characterize Mexican guitar styles. He learned these patterns during his youth, watching Mexican guitarists in Phoenix's barrios and along the border. The guitar wasn't just accompaniment, it was a second voice telling the story. The vocal style Robbins developed for these songs was equally revolutionary. He adopted the dramatic phrasing of Mexican ranchera singers with their emotional crescendos and intimate whispers. Listen carefully to El Paso, and you'll hear how he alternates between the straightforward narrative style of country music and the more passionate delivery of Mexican folk singers. This was particularly evident in his use of sustained notes at the end of phrases, a technique common in Mexican music but rarely heard in country at the time. The structure of his border ballads borrowed heavily from the corrido tradition. Corridos are Mexican narrative ballads that tell stories of heroes, outlaws, and tragic love affairs. Exactly the themes Robbins explored. Like traditional corridos, his songs followed a specific pattern, setting the scene, introducing the conflict, building to a climactic moment, and ending with a moral or reflection. This was a dramatic departure from the verse-chorus-verse pattern of traditional country music. Even the backing vocals in songs like El Paso were influenced by Mexican musical traditions. The echo effects and harmonies weren't just artistic choices. They mimicked the call-and-response patterns common in Mexican folk music. Robbins had heard these techniques in the Mexican working songs during his days in the cotton fields, where workers would echo the leader's lines to keep rhythm during their labor. The instrumental arrangements also reflected this cultural fusion. While maintaining enough country elements to satisfy radio programmers, Robbins incorporated traditional Mexican instruments and rhythms. The trumpet parts in some of his border ballads weren't just Western flourishes. They were carefully crafted to echo the mariachi traditions he'd grown up hearing. His attention to musical authenticity extended even to the tempo changes within songs. The way El Paso shifts pace throughout the narrative mirrors the dynamic tempo changes common in Mexican folk music, where the music's speed often matches the emotional intensity of the story being told. This was a sophisticated musical technique that few country artists of the era dared to attempt. But these musical elements were only part of the story. To create truly authentic border ballads, Robbins needed more than just the right sound. He needed real places and real stories to draw from. The fascinating truth about the actual locations and people that inspired these songs reveals just how deeply rooted they were in border culture. The authenticity of Robbins' border ballads came from real places and people, though he often blended fact and fiction to protect the privacy of his inspirations. Today, we can finally piece together the true stories behind these legendary songs. Rosa's Cantina, made famous in El Paso, still stands today at 3454 Donovan Drive in El Paso, Texas. While the building has changed over the years, it remains a testament to the real-world foundations of Robbins' storytelling. In the 1950s, it was exactly the kind of border town establishment Robbins described. A place where cultures merged, where Mexican music played nightly, and where stories of love and tragedy unfolded regularly. The real Rosa, whose full name was Rosa Sanchez, owned and operated the cantina with her husband. According to local historians, she was known for her hospitality and for maintaining an establishment that attracted both Anglo and Mexican customers, a rarity in the segregated 1950s. While Robbins never publicly confirmed whether he'd actually met Rosa, his detailed descriptions of the cantina's atmosphere suggest he spent considerable time there. The character of Felina, the Mexican dancer who captures the narrator's heart in El Paso, was based on several women Robbins had known during his years along the border. He deliberately spelled her name unusually, rather than the traditional Felina, to help English speakers with pronunciation. But the inspiration for her character came from the Mexican dancers he'd watched in his youth, particularly in Phoenix's Mexican Quarter. In Big Iron, the town of Agua Fria was a real settlement in Arizona, though it's now a ghost town. Robbins had passed through it many times during his early years, and its remote location and mixed population made it the perfect setting for his tale of law and order on the border. The character of Texas Red was likely an amalgamation of several notorious outlaws who operated in the border region during the late 1800s. The physical landscape described in these songs was something Robbins knew intimately. The Badlands of New Mexico mentioned in El Paso were places he'd actually ridden through. The streets of Laredo weren't just lyrics, but real locations he'd visited. Even the mountain passes and desert trails described in his songs were based on actual routes used by both lawmen and outlaws along the border. Local residents from El Paso to Phoenix have passed down stories about Robbins' visits to their communities, each adding another piece to the puzzle of his border ballad inspirations. Many recall him spending hours in small cantinas, listening to local musicians and collecting stories from old-timers who remembered the wild days of the border territory. These real places and people gave Robbins' songs their undeniable authenticity, but their impact would reach far beyond the border regions that inspired them. The legacy of these border ballads would influence generations of musicians and forever change the way country music approached storytelling and cultural fusion. And that legacy continues to resonate in surprising ways today. The impact of Marty Robbins' border ballads extends far beyond their initial success, creating ripples that continue to influence country music today. These songs didn't just tell stories. They opened doors for cultural fusion in country music that had previously been firmly closed. The immediate influence was felt in Nashville, where other artists began incorporating Mexican elements into their music. Johnny Cash, inspired by Robbins' success, recorded his own border-themed songs, including Ring of Fire, which featured distinctive Mexican-style horns. Willie Nelson's critically acclaimed album Red-Headed Stranger followed Robbins' template of telling a complete narrative through interconnected songs. But the influence went beyond just musical style. Robbins had proven that country music could tackle complex narratives and cultural themes while still maintaining commercial success. This emboldened a new generation of storyteller-songwriters like Townes Van Zandt and Guy Clark, who cited Robbins as a major influence on their narrative approach to songwriting. The cross-cultural appeal of these songs also helped break down barriers in country music. Before Robbins, Mexican-American audiences were largely ignored by the country music establishment. His border ballads created a bridge between cultures, drawing Mexican-American listeners to country music, while introducing Anglo audiences to elements of Mexican musical tradition. Modern artists continue to draw inspiration from Robbins' border ballads. The Tex-Mex movement, led by artists like the Mavericks and Los Lobos, built upon the foundation Robbins laid. Contemporary country stars like George Strait and Marty Stewart have recorded their own versions of his songs, introducing them to new generations of listeners. The technical innovations Robbins introduced have become standard tools in country music. The extended narrative song, once considered radio poison, is now a respected format, as evidenced by modern epics like Three Wooden Crosses by Randy Travis. The use of dramatic tempo changes and cultural fusion, which Robbins pioneered, can be heard in the work of modern artists from Brad Paisley to the Chicks. In recent years, there's been a resurgence of interest in Robbins' border ballads among Americana and alternative country artists. Musicians like Calexico and Robert Ellis have cited these songs as inspiration for their own border-influenced sound. Music scholars have begun studying these songs as early examples of successful cultural fusion in American popular music, recognizing their significance beyond mere entertainment. The Recording Industry Association of America, ERIAA, has certified El Paso as double platinum, indicating sales of over 2 million copies. But more importantly, the song has been inducted into both the Grammy Hall of Fame and the National Recording Registry of the Library of Congress, recognizing its historical and cultural significance. But perhaps the most important legacy of Marty Robbins' border ballads isn't just their influence on music. It's their enduring message about the power of cultural understanding. In our final chapter, we'll explore how these songs, born from Robbins' genuine appreciation for Mexican culture, continue to serve as a blueprint for authentic cultural exchange in American music. Looking back at Marty Robbins' border ballads today, we can see them as more than just brilliant pieces of musical storytelling. They were cultural bridges built at a time when such connections were rare and often discouraged. What made these songs special wasn't just their commercial success, but the authentic way they represented both American and Mexican cultural elements. The secret behind their enduring appeal lies in Robbins' genuine connection to both cultures. Unlike many artists who might have used Mexican elements as mere exotic decoration, Robbins drew from deep personal experience and genuine respect for the culture. His childhood in Arizona, his friendships with Mexican Americans, and his love for border culture all contributed to songs that rang true for listeners on both sides of the border. These songs continue to resonate today because they tackle themes that remain relevant: love that transcends cultural boundaries, the complex relationship between neighboring cultures, and the rich tapestry of life along the border. In our current era, when discussions about the border often focus on division, Robbins' songs remind us of the beauty that comes from cultural fusion. The technical innovations Robbins introduced, the extended narrative, the cultural fusion, the complex musical arrangements, have become part of country music's standard toolbox. But perhaps more importantly, his approach to cultural integration serves as a model for how artists can respectfully incorporate elements from other traditions into their work. Today, Rosa's Cantina still stands in El Paso, a physical reminder of these legendary songs. Tourists and music lovers still visit, hoping to capture some of the magic that inspired El Paso. The building may have changed, but the spirit of cultural fusion that Robbins celebrated lives on in the mix of music, language, and tradition that continues to characterize life along the border. In the end, Marty Robbins did more than just create hit songs. He documented a unique time and place in American culture, where two distinct traditions met and merged to create something new and beautiful. His border ballads stand as testament to the power of music to bridge cultural divides and tell universal stories that touch hearts across all boundaries. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the real story behind Marty Robbins' Mexican ballads, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from country music history. And let us know in the comments, which of Robbins' border ballads is your favorite? Until next time, this is Southern Sound, celebrating the legends of country music.